Buenos colegas y de un área bien particular, la relación sustrato-interacción con organismos, focalizado principalmente hoy día en todo lo que es la relación de las huellas de dinosaurios y quién los contiene, ¿ya? Y como geólogos siempre tenemos que estar claros de que el registro está en las rocas, y ese es nuestro principal elemento de estudio. Bueno, aquí como ven, viene en la lámina Christian Meyer, que ya estuvo el año pasado y dio su charla. Ya nos conocemos hace un año y por primera vez en Chile, Mateo y Dorothy, que también andan con sus estudiantes. También les sirva de motivación. Yo también en el pregrado como estudiante tuve la oportunidad de poder ir a trabajar afuera un poco. Así que bueno, sé de que hay harta gente también de manera online. Y después, after you talk, anyway, many people it is online too, but also will be charged after that in YouTube. And anyway, if you need the link, I can send you if you want to send it to your friends too. Y bueno, la charla en inglés, las palabras técnicas son fáciles, todos tienen inglés acá en la universidad. Así que bienvenido, y en la primera charla quiero dejar, bueno, un reconocido paleognólogo de dinosaurio, uno de los mejores del mundo, el profesor Dr. Christian Meyer de la Universidad de Basel, así que a quien invito a que pueda comenzar. Así que muchas gracias.
Gracias, Christian. Bienvenidos por la primera charla y para... Oh, sorry, I go back to English, it's easier. I just give you a short overview of my CV. 100 years ago, I started my studies in the University of Bern, where I did my master's and my PhD. I was most of my time also working in museums as a curator of earth sciences. I did a postdoc in the US for 2 years. I was even a visiting professor in Vienna. And since a couple of years, I've been the general director of the Museum of Natural History, where I took an early retirement in 2017 to actually just do research. I have different projects. Among those is the late Jurassic dinosaur tracks of Chile, but I've been working for 20 years in Bolivia, in the United States, and a little bit everywhere where I like to go. Well, today we're going to talk about the function of the substrate, which is very important to preserve dinosaur tracks. Here you have an example from Morocco. These big blobs here are dinosaur tracks. This is a continental sediment, and this is a marine sediment. And you can see that the dinosaur tracks were infilled by marine sediment, and these are mainly sauropods. And if we look at dinosaur tracks, we need to know something about the sedimentology. Well, first we look at some of the tracks. We look at the sedimentary context. We look at how we think dinosaur tracks formed. And then we look at the substrate before we have a short conclusion. So we have 3 different types of fossils. We have chemical fossils, we have body fossils, and we have actually biogenic structures. That's what we are talking about, because dinosaur tracks are biogenic structures. Within these, we have different types of biogenic structures. We have death marks, we have pseudo tracks like the one on top right. This is supposed to be the Manus track of Jesus in Jerusalem. We have bioerosion tracks from sponges. We have other activity of biological origin like spider nets. We have stromatolites, and we have biodepository structures like coprolites or eggs. And what we are talking about is actually bioturbation, and among those we have different types, and particularly dinosaur tracks like this. Well, today you can actually classify different types of trace fossils. On the left side, you have the classification originally made by Adolf Seilacher in different types. Today, actually, we divide trace fossils because of their behavior, so the ethology of trace fossils. And in most of the cases, dinosaur tracks are what we call repichnia, So that means tracks of an animal that has been moving. Dinosaurs have different appearances. Most of the groups we know, the dinosaur tracks, mainly from the Therophorans, the Ornithischians, we have also the Saurischians. The most conspicuous one, where we're dealing also here in Chile, are tracks of theropods and sauropods. Maybe also some new ones to discover. Well, the facies is very important. We find tracks almost in any kind of sedimentary environment, be it in rivers, in shelf deposits, in alluvial plain, in delta deposits, even in dunes or in margins of lakes. But so far we have no dinosaur tracks in glaciers and moraines. Depositional environment, we have different types of models. We have, let's look at the wave-dominated delta. We have fluvial-dominated deltas, the fluvial plains. We have open lake or closed lake systems or carbonate platforms where we find different types of tracks. So if you study dinosaur tracks, you have to be aware of what kind of sedimentary facies you're working in. Hola, Javiera. What kind of methodology are we using? We are actually do field work, not only lab work. We look at sections. We look at the macrofacies. We do thin sections, look at the microfacies. We measure tracks. We analyze tracks. And we compare tracks. And of course, we use some interesting machines like drones. So we can do 3D correlations in outcrops that are not very well accessible. Especially here in Chile, the outcrops are a bit crumbly, so you cannot climb. Otherwise, we would climb it too, no problem. So how do tracks form? This is a very simple model. First of all, you have a foot that goes into a soft substrate, and it leaves a track. And in the best cases, it's covered by sediment. And after the diagenesis and after tectonic movements, you can find either a natural mold or a filled mold. Usually, this is the most simple model, which is actually just a model. So how do they form? We have different types of formation. We have different types of tracks. We have so-called true tracks or elite tracks, which are the best preserved. We have under tracks. That means tracks that are below the actual surface or deeper tracks. And important is the substrate. That means the humidity, the grain size, the texture, the thickness. If we have underlying layers that are lithified, or for instance, microbial mats, which are important. And on the other hand, we have the track maker, which has 4 important parameters: the weight, the anatomy, the dynamics, and also the behavior. Because depending on the behavior, you leave different tracks. You know that when you leave the disco and you're a bit drunk, you do different tracks when you're after breakfast. But, okay, we have, after that, you have the change of the tracks. You have a physical perturbation like erosion, precipitation. You have desiccation. You might have evaporating minerals that form. You have, again, inundation. You have about also perturbation, biological perturbation, like phytokarst, microbial mats. You have other invertebrates that graze and might change the original track. So that's what we call modification. And also the preservation is important, but this is the part what we call taphonomy. So we need to take into account all these different kinds of things to understand how tracks are formed and how tracks are actually becoming fossils. This is a model. A track is actually the result of the interaction of substrate, anatomy, and dynamics of the animal that produces the tracks. It's just a model. And you can also model this. There's a colleague of us who did that, modeling the tracks with a guinea fowl to show that tracks on the surface look different than tracks that are deeper down in the substrate. But these are computational models, and models stay models. And if you go to the actual tracks, it looks a bit different. This is my colleague, Jim Farlow. He has done some neo-ichnological studies with an emu. So this is the original track of the emu. And 1 centimeter below, you have an undertrack that looks already different. 1 centimeter more, you see it might be a track. And down below in the sublayers, it might be a track, but it's very difficult to determine. So you have to keep in mind that only the real tracks on the surface, you're able to make a good interpretation, but the rest is very difficult. That's an emu. The substrate is important. So we have a couple of students here in the Biscayne. You can see how they walk on a substrate with microbial mats. So we do also, let's say, experiment with students to understand the formation of hominid tracks. This is the footprint of one of my students, Donny Marty, in different environments. You see, this is there's a thin microbial mat. This is a dry water, moist, unsaturated, and water saturated. It's the same hominid, leaving completely different tracks. And we have to take this into account when we study footprints. Down below, you have a thick microbial crust, and you can see that the footprints look completely different. So this is very important when we study tracks. We need to know what was type of substrate at the time of formation. So these are actual substrates, like here, water saturated inundation. You have humans and goats. You can see it's a silty sediment, but you can hardly see any of the tracks. This is a dried up body with mud cracks. It's a camel. And here you have a herd of camels on loose sands in the White Desert. You can see it. Or here, a thin microbial mat that starts to desiccate, and you have small mammal tracks here. Or I like this in particular. This is a human footprint in a wadi, very, very deep, that has been dried up later on, or a seagull on loose sand. So the substrate is important, and also the grain size. This is a picture of a wadi in Oman. You can see it's a desiccated surface with some footprints. And if you look closer, you can see different types of tracks. We have first tracks of a goat that has been left in a water-saturated sediment. It's very deep. Then we have another one of a goat when the substrate was only moist. We have a first generation of mud cracks, the small ones here. And then we have other tracks when the substrate was almost dry, and at the final end you have the large desiccation tracks. So this is one substrate that takes different types of tracks in different stages of drying up and saturation in the water. And if we see this example, we need to actually always think of examples like these to understand dinosaur tracks and their morphology. This is a very interesting, what do we say? It's an experiment with two ichnologists. We did that 3 weeks ago on a beach in Spain. And there are two ichnologists. One lady is actually carrying a 25-kilogram sample of dinosaur tracks we collected on the beach. And the other lady is not carrying anything. And you see the grain size is the same, the weight is different. You can see how they leave different tracks. So size, weight plays a role. You can see that the deeper tracks on the right side and the tracks of Lara and Laura, two ichnologists on the beach, leaving completely different tracks. Experiment. Well, you can apply that to fossil tracks. Up here we have a graduate student who left his tracks in a water-saturated, unsaturated, and moist and damp substrate. You can see all these different tracks, and you can see how the morphology changes with the water content in the substrate. And you can use that in looking at fossil trackways, like the one here is a sauropod from the late Cretaceous of Bolivia. You can see here the substrate is non-saturated. Here it is moist. It leaves just faint tracks, and here again the substrate is not waterlogged. It leaves a little bit deeper tracks, and that explains also why you sometimes find just partial trackways and then they're gone. And you say, where are they? They're here, but you don't see them because the substrate has a different water content. Or like here, a longer section of a theropod footprint from Calorco. Also, you have the same. You have humid substrate condition, and in between you have a substrate that is not very saturated, and it leaves a different morphology, different depths. And we have to take this into account when we look at single tracks to understand what type of substrate this is. And this is only possible if we go a little bit further, not looking only at the morphology, but looking at the real rocks and understand the lithology. This is another one. You can see two parallel sauropod tracks, and in between 1 or 2 meters, substrate condition changes, which is actually completely normal. If you walk around the beach, you can see that in some places you have water-saturated parts, and just 50 centimeters away, you have non-saturated substrate, and that makes the difference. And this we have to understand and take it into account to understand the formation. Like this, ankylosaurs, non-saturated, different deep tracks, and this is a almost dried up sediment. It's the same type of animal that leaves a completely different morphology. And sometimes in the past, people have described 3 different ichnospecies just to name them without understanding the context of the substrate, which makes ichnology sometimes a bit complicated. Or this is an example from Morocco, and you can see that this is the best, what we call an elite track, and it's the same animal that leaves completely different morphologies depending on the depth of the track. And this is actually linked to the water content within the sediment. It's the same surface. Here, I think 3 different ichnospecies have been described, although it's just a theropod dinosaur track, nothing else. Here are different types. And you can see that actually the preservation changes. We have on the right side, we have a fine-grained sandstone, and we have a footprint of an archosaur where you can even see the preservation of the scales. And on the other hand, here, a micrite where you just leave a blob and nothing else. You can still see it's a sauropod track, and you have everything in between. Here's a grainstone. You can see the different microphases, and the microphases actually and the grain size determines the type and accuracy of preservation mainly. So the microphases is important. So if you do vertebrate ichnology, bring your hammer, take a sample and make thin sections to understand what's happening. Here are different environments. Up here you have a brackish delta, coarse sandstone, and the sandstone of a crevasse splay, stegosaur footprints, and sauropod footprints. Here you have tidal flat, mainly micrites or dolomites. Here, for instance, you have a phytokarst, this karst that's growing over. Here you have a microbial mat that actually destroys somehow the morphology of the dinosaur tracks. Dolomites, or here sauropods. Again, sandstones, siltstone, perfect preservation here. This is the alluvial plain. This is an example of the Quebrada de Huatacondo from Chile, the theropod, or up here, different types of sauropods from the Cretaceous in oolitic rainstones, be it lacustrine or also volcanic, or interdune behind grain sandstones here in the early Jurassic. And you can see that the morphology changes. This is important. So that means when you do work on vertebrate technology, you have to know your sedimentary environment. So you go from the microphages to the macrophages to understand the environment. So that means, oh, this is a bit, yeah, it doesn't matter. The take-home message means we need to understand dinosaur tracks, we need large outcrops to understand the behavior and the context of preservation. We need to know the sedimentary environment and the depositional environment. We need to know the microphages and the macrophages. And also, if we have ichnotaxonomical problems, if we want to compare different dinosaur tracks, we try to compare similar microphages together, which in the past has been very difficult because most of the vertebrate paleontologists who work with tracks don't look at the sediments. So usually when you find it in a publication, you don't find what kind of sediments they're formed in. And of course, we need a larger context. We need to know the microphages, the stratigraphic context. We need also to know the sea level cycles to understand the whole complex paleoecological system we are working in. Thanks for your attention. De nada, de nada.
Gracias,
That's how we
Christian.
are working in Switzerland, you see? Yes. And so we're taking this is at 3,300 meters. It takes you 8 hours to climb up there, which makes it impossible to do it one day. So we use a special tool, we call this helicopter. And the helicopter lands here, and it's not really landing. You have to jump out, and then you have to prepare everything to secure you on the rope to do casts. That's from last year.
Gracias,
Thank
Christian.
you. De nada.
Gracias. Preguntas, colegas. Don Felipe.
Interesting work, really interesting. Couple of questions, basically.
Of course, go ahead.
You put something related with a ecological approach.
Mm-hmm.
One of the main things that I have in mind is how to actually, if you see the landscape completely variable, I mean, the way that you measure the things, track, but how reliable is measured track and later to generate information so they get some idea about the weight or the speed of the or I don't know. I try to think about what if you need to measure this animal in order to get another ecological variable, for example. So that's my question: how reliable it is.
We have actually
kind of big.
We base actually speed calculations.
All right.
On modern studies on mammals,
Mm-hmm.
which is an approximation.
All right.
Of course. You have an actual rule of thumb that 4 times your footprint length is the height of your hip, and you can also. Okay, I'm here.
I think I have to.
It's okay. Don't worry. That's approximation.
All right.
We cannot know it. The problem on top of that is the actual foot size.
All right.
We measure something, but we really don't know what we measure because we don't know how much flesh was around the anatomical foot.
Oh,
because we know the anatomy from skeletons,
okay.
but we rarely find complete feet. Sometimes we find it,
All right.
we see scales and stuff like that, so we know it's the actual foot.
Yeah, because I was thinking last night, I would just check up a paper about body size distribution in dinosaur.
Yeah.
So what was great, what height if you measure in order to maximize the data?
Yeah.
So what if you just take some prints, footprints, and with that you can estimate also the weight, and that you can increase also the data about the body size of an animal.
Yeah, we come back to the problem of the substrate.
Yeah.
Because how should I estimate the weight if people who study the dinosaur tracks don't give you any indication about the substrate? We need to know what the microfacies is. We need to know if it's a compressed or whatever. And this is the main problem.
Right.
But it would be possible, of course. It would be very
also,
interesting.
you have another problem with the taxonomy,
Yeah.
I guess.
The taxonomy, yes, but this is another question.
Right.
But at least what we can see, if we have very large surfaces, we can see behavior, like limping dinosaurs or dinosaurs that make curves or whatever. Or sometimes you can see also that they move in age classes. And what we also know is that most of the sites are more or less a census assemblage, because you have just a very short window where you can form the tracks and preserve them. Usually the people said, oh, this is 100 of years, but it's probably just a short time. So we have more or less a census.
Mm-hmm.
But if you go just for the skeletons, you don't know how much is preserved. Maybe 5% of all the animals that live are finally fossilized. The tracks, we have no estimation, but it would be interesting to do that. Yes, I agree.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, thank you.
Welcome.
Otra pregunta, la que sea, aunque sea bien básica o cosas por el estilo. Diego.
Okay. If you want me to.
For the presentation, very good. We have learned that the subtract is very important for preservation, but is there like a perfect subtract type for mineral properties, like presence of clay minerals or something like that? Is there like a perfect
Yes,
subtract?
I would say a very fine silt that is very cohesive, not very waterlogged. You can do that yourself. You can figure out, you walk over a coarse grain beach, your tracks won't be very well preserved, but if you walk maybe a little bit back in a silty puddle, you see everything in your feet. So this is the finer, the better, usually. So we see most of the tracks that have scales preserved and stuff like this are usually in alluvial plains where you have very fine silty substrates.
No, Christian, just a comment. I will do it in Spanish, mainly for the students.
Claro.
I will say something that I learned with you last time in the fieldwork, and you can add it in the comment. Claro, Christian habla de la huella de dinosaurio, que se ven fácil y más visible al ojo. Pero con Christian ahí aprendí bastante el año pasado, que en otro terreno, que claro, como geólogos sabemos de que ese dinosaurio por algo pasó por ahí, está en un ecosistema, iba en tránsito, y si va en tránsito en el día tiene que comer. Y está en un ecosistema, y si transitó por ahí es porque hay agua o alimento, o es una ruta que ya hacía todos los años, o en el periodo de primavera, o en la migración. Y también ahí Christian ponía mucho ojo, porque si queda la huella de dinosaurio, quedan marcas de cangrejo, de gusano, u otros organismos que están en un ecosistema. Y si puedes completar el comentario, Christian.
Oh, we have to look at everything. That's what is important.
But your Spanish is good.
Okay. Well, depends on the level of red wine.
It's too early.
No, I think it's also the larger context is also always important. We need to know the paleogeography. For instance, we studied the the late Cretaceous dinosaur tracks of Bolivia, and we would find outcrops that are maybe 2,500 kilometers on the same stretch. And if you measure the direction of the dinosaur tracks, you can see that they're actually migrating. And we think they're migrating seasonally. So that is the very larger context from the single footprint or on the dinosaur tracks who drinks or looks for food. And of course, the invertebrates are important too.
Sí, claro, o sea, todo el contexto, siempre, y no olvidarnos que somos geólogos, o sea, la roca es una radiografía de lo que queda. Ya no es, porque a veces pasa en paleontología qué dinosaurio este, y siempre pensarlo como geólogo que es un contexto. Y la roca es una página del libro que se escribió ese día en ese ambiente, ¿no? Hay que ver siempre así un poco la paleontología, y se preserva en un medio que es el sedimento, ¿ya? El hielo, el ámbar en otros casos, pero más frecuente, incluso hemos encontrado trilobites en rocas metamórficas, ¿ya? Son ya rocas que han cambiado bastante. ¿Vale? Y siempre todo dato es bienvenido. Any data is welcome.
Well, voy a hacerla en español.
Sí, claro.
Do you mind? Tú mostraste un modelo, al principio de tu presentación, un modelo basado en computarizado.
Sí.
¿Cierto? ¿Qué tipo de variables ingresaron ahí para generar el modelo que mostraste?
El modelo fue de Peter Falkingham, y el modelo fue un sustrato plástico.
All right.
I think we need a coarse sand or very fine gravel.
Right, but
And
what
it's
sort of...
frozen sand. There is no cohesive. But I'm also
And
there is no the cohesion of the substrate is not evaluated on in that model. But when it was done 8 years ago, it was the computing power needed to make the substrate cohesive. It was too much.
it was loose grains.
It's like a loose coarse sand. The closest your say aqueous element on that.
And the grains were radioactive. I think so.
I don't know.
So he could actually use a X-ray to find the deeper parts. Yes, but it's not a real substrate.
Okay. The other thing is, actually, you can model it through machine learning.
Yes, he will show it.
So such a way to think.
I think Italy is already working on that.
The machine learning thing aspect is very interesting, but the problem is the input of the model, because there has been a, and the problem is that the machine learning model starts from drawings, which are subjective. So we need models plus the substrate to really increase our knowledge. Otherwise, we just compare drawings, which are subjective. Yeah, so that the constraints are a bit loose, but I agree with you. He will show it. Don't worry, he's coming.
Not all of it.
Vielen Dank, Herr Professor.
Danke, Professor.